The silence in my apartment was a carefully curated thing. It was built from the neat stacks of books on the floor, the single coffee mug in the dish rack, and the hum of the old refrigerator that was my only constant companion. I had arranged my life into a series of quiet, predictable routines, not out of a love for order, but out of a need for a barricade against the noise of failure. At 27, I was a freelance archivist, which was a polite way of saying I organized the remnants of other people's more interesting lives for a paycheck that barely covered rent. My world was small, contained, and safe. It was also profoundly lonely. The only crack in my fortress of solitude was a single, dog-eared magazine clipping tucked inside my oldest copy of Leaves of Grass. It was a profile on Julian Croft from a local business journal, published 2 years ago. The photograph showed a man in his late 40s, with silver threading his dark hair at the temples and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, quiet gravity. He wasn't smiling, not really, but there was a softness at the corners of his mouth that suggested he could. He was a billionaire, a restorer of historic buildings, a patron of the arts, a figure who belonged to a world entirely separate from mine. Yet, I kept the clipping. It was a foolish, secret little thing, a connection to a man I'd never meet, a placeholder for a kind of steadiness I craved. My days were measured in the scent of aging paper and the delicate task of deciphering faded ink. I found a certain peace in it, in bringing order to the chaos of the past. It was a job that demanded patience and a gentle hand, two qualities I had in abundance. What it didn't demand was interaction, which suited the guarded person I had become. My last relationship had ended badly, leaving me with a deep-seated distrust of grand gestures and loud promises. I preferred the quiet, the understated, the things that proved their worth over time. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, catching me between sips of lukewarm coffee. It was from the Croft Foundation. The subject line was stark: Archival Project Inquiry. My heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. I read the message 3 times, my eyes snagging on the name, Julian Croft, listed as the project overseer. They were looking for a specialist to organize and catalog the private papers of his late grandfather, Alastair Croft, a man whose name was etched onto the cornerstones of half the city's oldest buildings. It was a 6-week contract. The compensation they offered was more than I made in 6 months. It felt like a mistake, a message intended for someone with a more impressive resume, a longer list of credentials. But my name was there, clear as day. Leo Vance. A colleague I'd done a small project for last year must have recommended me. It was the only explanation. I drafted a reply, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, trying to sound professional and competent, not like a man whose stomach was tying itself in knots. I wrote about my experience with pre-war documents, my methodology for preservation. I attached my portfolio and hit send before I could lose my nerve. The response came in less than an hour. Mr. Croft requested a meeting. In person, at his residence. My breath caught. The address was in the old part of the city, a neighborhood of stone mansions and ancient oak trees that I only ever drove through on my way to somewhere else. It was a world of quiet, established wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that Julian Croft embodied. Before I left, I looked at the magazine clipping again. The man in the photo seemed to watch me, his expression unreadable. I felt a tremor of fear, a voice in my head whispering that I was out of my depth. This was a man who could buy and sell my entire life with the interest from his pocket change. But beneath the fear was something else, a flicker of hope that felt dangerous and thrilling. This was an opportunity, not just for the money, but for a glimpse into a world I had only ever observed from a distance. A glimpse of him. The day of the meeting, I changed my shirt 3 times, settling on a simple blue button-down that was clean and pressed, but not too formal. I drove my sputtering 10-year-old car through the wrought iron gates of the Croft estate, feeling like an imposter. The house wasn't just a house. It was a testament to history, a sprawling stone structure that looked as if it had grown out of the earth itself, softened by ivy and time. It didn't shout its wealth. It murmured it in the language of impeccable stonework and manicured gardens. A housekeeper with a kind, placid face led me through a cavernous foyer into a library that stole my breath. It was 2 stories high, walled with dark wood shelves that groaned under the weight of thousands of books. A spiral staircase curled up to a second-level balcony. The air smelled of leather, old paper, and lemon oil. And in the center of it all, standing by a massive oak desk, was Julian Croft. He was taller than I'd expected, and the photograph hadn't done justice to the quiet intensity of his presence. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark trousers, clothes that were impeccably tailored but understated. The silver at his temples was more pronounced in person, and there were fine lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and concentration. He turned as I entered, and those eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, settled on me. It wasn't an invasive gaze. It was assessing, calm, and incredibly focused. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice was a low, warm baritone, smoother than I'd imagined. It filled the cavernous room without echoing. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Croft." I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. I extended a hand, and he took it. His grip was firm, his hand warm and dry. It was a capable hand, the kind that could fix things, build things. The contact lasted only a moment, but the warmth of it lingered on my skin. He gestured to a pair of leather armchairs near a cold fireplace. "Please sit." He moved with an unhurried grace, a man completely at ease in his own space. I sat on the edge of the cushion, feeling like a nervous bird perched where it didn't belong. He sat opposite me, not leaning back, but sitting forward slightly, giving me his full attention. It was a subtle gesture, but it felt like respect. "Your portfolio is impressive," he began, his gaze direct. "Your work on the city's founding documents was meticulous. That's what I need here. Meticulousness. And discretion." He slid a slim leather-bound folder across the coffee table between us. I opened it. It was a non-disclosure agreement. It was pages long, dense with legal terminology, but the essence was simple. Whatever I saw or read in his grandfather's papers was to remain within the walls of this house, forever. My signature would bind me to absolute silence. "My grandfather was a public figure," Julian explained, his voice even. "But his private life was just that. Private. These papers contain correspondence, journals, business dealings, some of which are sensitive. I need to trust the person who handles them." He paused, and his eyes held mine. "This agreement is not a suggestion, Leo. May I call you Leo?" The switch to my first name was so smooth, so natural, that it took me a second to register. "Yes, of course, the NDA is ironclad," he continued. "It's for my family's protection, but it's also for yours. It creates a space of absolute confidence. No one will ask you what you're working on, and you will have a legal shield if they do. Within this project, your only responsibility is to the historical record, and to me." He wasn't threatening me. He was explaining the parameters. He was building the walls of the world we would share for the next 6 weeks. It was a world of secrets, of history, and of proximity to him. I looked down at the document, at the stark black ink on crisp white paper. It was a cage, in a way, but it also felt like a sanctuary, a place where the rules were clear and the outside world couldn't intrude. I looked up and met his gaze. "I understand completely. Discretion is the foundation of my profession." A flicker of something, approval, perhaps, warmed his expression. "I thought it might be." He gestured to the document. "Take your time. Read it. If you agree to the terms, the job is yours." I didn't need to read it. I already knew my answer. This was more than a job. It was a door opening into a room I had only ever dreamed of looking into. I picked up the pen he'd set beside the folder. The ink flowed smoothly as I signed my name, the sound of the nib scratching against the paper the only noise in the vast, silent library. I was binding myself to him, to his history, to his house. I slid the signed agreement back across the table. He took it, glanced at my signature, and then looked at me. For the first time, the corner of his mouth lifted into that soft, almost smile from the photograph. "Welcome, Leo. Let's get you started." The first few days were a blur of dust and discovery. The papers were stored in a series of archival boxes in a small, climate-controlled room adjoining the library. Julian showed me the space, the scent of old paper and leather even stronger there. He walked me through the security protocols with a patient, methodical calm, his presence a steadying weight beside me. He explained that he worked from his home office, which was just through a door on the far side of the library, and that I should not hesitate to ask if I needed anything. He gave me a key card that granted me access to the grounds, the main house, and the library wing. "You can set your own hours," he said, his gaze serious. "Within reason." I trust your judgment. That trust felt heavier, more valuable, than the key card in my hand. He was giving me a piece of his home, a piece of his family's legacy. He was letting me in. I established a routine quickly, arriving each morning at 9 and leaving at 5, just like a normal job. But nothing about it felt normal. I was working in a space that felt more like a museum, surrounded by priceless art and first editions, with the quiet, powerful presence of Julian Croft just a room away. I spent most of my time alone with the ghosts of his family. I read his grandfather's spidery handwriting, deciphering letters from politicians, love notes to his wife, and angry journal entries about business rivals. I was piecing together a man I'd never met, and with each document I handled, I felt a strange sense of connection to the grandson who had hired me. I saw the origins of Julian's quiet strength in Alistair's journals, the seed of his appreciation for history in the carefully preserved architectural drawings. Julian rarely interrupted me. He was a man who understood the sanctity of focus. But he would appear at odd, quiet moments. Around 10:30 each morning, he would enter the library holding 2 mugs of coffee. He'd place one on the corner of my large work table without a word, his fingers brushing the polished wood. The first time he did it, I nearly jumped out of my skin, so lost was I in a letter from 1938. "I thought you might need this," he said, his voice low. "Oh, thank you." "You didn't have to," he just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his head, and retreated to his office. The coffee was perfect, dark, strong, with no sugar. He had somehow known exactly how I liked it. It became a ritual. He never asked if I wanted it. He just brought it. It was a small, silent gesture of care, a punctuation mark in the quiet hours of my day. I started to look forward to it, to the brief, 2-foot proximity, the faint scent of his cologne, something clean and subtle, like sandalwood and bergamot, and the warmth of the mug he left behind. I began to observe him in the moments he wasn't observing me. Through the crack of his office door, which he always left slightly ajar, I would catch glimpses of him on the phone, his voice calm and decisive. I watched the way he would rub the back of his neck when he was concentrating, the way his brow would furrow slightly. I saw him stand and stretch, a tall, lean silhouette against the bright window, a man carrying the weight of an empire with an understated grace that fascinated me. He had a way of moving, a deliberateness that suggested he never wasted an ounce of energy. His hands, especially, drew my attention. They were strong and elegant, whether he was signing a document, holding a coffee mug, or simply resting them on his desk. I would imagine those hands sorting through these same papers, feeling the same connection to the past that I did. I wondered if he felt the weight of it all, the legacy his grandfather had left him. One afternoon, I was struggling with a heavy box of ledgers, trying to lift it onto a high shelf. It was awkward, and I was losing my grip. Suddenly, a firm pressure was at my back, and a pair of hands closed over mine, steadying the box. "Let me," Julian's voice said, right by my ear. His body was pressed against mine for a brief, electric moment. I could feel the solid warmth of his chest through my shirt. My breath hitched. He effortlessly lifted the box and settled it onto the shelf. He stepped back, putting a careful foot of space between us, but the heat of his presence remained. "You should have asked for help," he said, his tone gentle, not chiding. "I'm sorry. I thought I had it." I mumbled, my face flushing. I was acutely aware of how close he had been, the scent of him, the sheer physical reality of him. He looked at me, his brown eyes searching my face. "There is no need to apologize for needing assistance, Leo. I am here. Use me." The words hung in the air, simple and direct, but they landed in my chest with a strange weight. He wasn't just talking about lifting boxes. He was talking about the project, about the support he was offering. But my mind, my foolish, yearning mind, heard something else entirely. I started to analyze everything. Every brief conversation, every shared glance. When he paused before speaking, I wondered what word he had decided against. When he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, I searched his expression for a sign, a flicker of something beyond professional courtesy. I was building a narrative in my head, a fragile structure of hope built on a foundation of maybes. He had a habit of walking the gardens in the late afternoon. I could see him from the library window. He would stroll along the stone paths, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in thought. He looked solitary, but not lonely. He looked like a king surveying his quiet kingdom. Sometimes he would stop and look up at the library window, and on more than one occasion, our eyes met across the expanse of manicured lawn. He would give me that same small, quiet nod, a silent acknowledgement of our shared space, and I would feel a jolt, a connection that was as real and as insubstantial as a beam of afternoon light. The tension was a low hum beneath the surface of our professional interactions. It was in the way I would hold my breath when he walked into the room. It was in the careful distance we maintained, a space charged with unspoken awareness. We were two men orbiting each other in a silent, stately home, bound by a contract of discretion that seemed to apply as much to our feelings as it did to his grandfather's secrets. One evening, I was working late, trying to finish cataloging a particularly fragile set of letters. I hadn't realized how the time had passed until I looked up and saw that the library was bathed in the soft glow of its lamps, the world outside a deep, velvety dark. I heard a sound and looked toward the office. Julian was standing in the doorway, watching me. He wasn't wearing his usual sweater, just a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. "You're still here," he stated, his voice soft in the quiet room. I lost track of time, I admitted, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "These letters are compelling." He walked over to my table and looked down at the delicate, browning paper under my gloved hands. "The ones to my grandmother," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He was very romantic. He was a man of great passions, Julian agreed, his gaze distant for a moment. He then looked at me, his eyes dark in the lamplight. "You shouldn't work through dinner. The housekeeper has gone home, but I was about to make something. Will you join me?" The invitation was casual, but it felt momentous. It was the first time he had suggested we do anything together outside the strict confines of our work arrangement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's an invitation, he said simply, his directness cutting through my hesitation. I can't have my archivist fainting from hunger. It would be bad for the project. There was a hint of dry humor in his tone, a light teasing that made me smile. "In that case," I said, carefully setting aside the letter, "I accept." We ate in the kitchen, a vast, modern space of stainless steel and dark wood that was a surprising contrast to the historic feel of the rest of the house. He made a simple pasta with garlic and oil, moving around the space with an easy, practiced competence. We sat at a small table near a window that looked out into the darkened garden. The silence between us was different here. It wasn't the studious silence of the library. It was a more companionable, domestic quiet. "Tell me what you found," he said, after a few moments. "Not the details. The NDA is safe," he added with that small smile. "But the impression. What kind of man do you think he was?" I thought for a moment, gathering my thoughts. He was brilliant and ruthless in business, but he was also deeply sentimental. He saved everything. Every note, every theater ticket, every dried flower she ever gave him. He built this empire. But his heart was a museum of small, private moments. Julian listened, his gaze fixed on my face, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "No one has ever put it that way," he said finally, his voice low. "But you're right. That was him. He taught me that the foundation of anything lasting, a building, a business, a family, is built on things no one else can see." He was looking at me, but I felt like he was seeing something more, something deeper. It was a moment of connection so profound it felt like a physical touch. We were no longer just an employer and his contractor. We were two people sharing a quiet meal, talking about the weight of the past. The professional boundary between us had become thin, almost transparent. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that I was falling for him. The storm arrived in the third week, a sudden, violent tempest that threw sheets of rain against the library's tall windows and made the ancient oaks outside groan in protest. The sky turned a bruised purple gray, and the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the vast room into a disorienting twilight. A low rumble of thunder shook the very foundations of the house. I was in the middle of transcribing a delicate, water-damaged journal, and my first instinct was panic for the papers. In the sudden gloom, I heard Julian's calm voice from his office. "Stay put, Leo. The generator will kick in a moment." His voice was a steady anchor in the sudden chaos. A few seconds later, a low hum started up from somewhere deep within the house, and a few emergency lights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows across the towering shelves. It wasn't enough light to work by, but it was enough to see. Julian appeared in the doorway of his office, his phone in his hand, its screen providing a small pool of light. "The main power grid is down for the whole district," he said, his tone matter of fact. "It could be hours. We should secure the documents you have out." There was a new dynamic between us, born of the unexpected crisis. We were a team. He held his phone aloft while I carefully placed the fragile journal back into its acid-free folder and returned it to its box. Our hands brushed as I closed the lid, and the contact was like a spark in the dim, charged air. Neither of us pulled away for a second, a silent acknowledgement of the energy that crackled between us. "There are lanterns in the kitchen," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual, "and a fireplace in here that works perfectly well. We can wait it out." He returned a few minutes later with 2 old-fashioned oil lanterns, their golden light pushing back the shadows and creating an intimate circle of warmth in the center of the massive library. He knelt before the grand fireplace, and with the practiced ease of a man who knew his home, he built and lit a fire. The crackle of the logs and the scent of burning oak filled the room, a comforting, elemental sound that settled my frayed nerves. We sat in the 2 leather armchairs, the firelight flickering on our faces. The storm raged outside, a distant, muffled roar, but inside our cocoon of light and warmth, it was peaceful. The professional roles we inhabited had been washed away by the rain and the dark. We were just 2 men, waiting out a storm. "Not quite the working conditions outlined in your contract," he said, a wry smile playing on his lips as he gazed into the flames. "I think I can manage," I replied, my own smile feeling more natural, less guarded than usual. "It's nice, actually." "The quiet, it is," he agreed, his gaze shifting from the fire to me. The golden light softened the lines on his face, made his eyes seem darker, deeper. "I'm sorry if this project has felt isolating for you." Confined to this room day after day, the comment surprised me. It was an admission of concern, a crack in his stoic facade. It was a moment of vulnerability. "I haven't felt isolated," I said, and the words were true. I felt focused. Protected, almost. He seemed to consider my words carefully. "Protected," he repeated softly. "That was the intention of the NDA, to create a space free from outside pressure. But I've been concerned. I worried it might feel like a cage, that I might seem—" He hesitated, searching for the word. "Controlling." This was it. A door opening. He was asking for reassurance, not as my employer, but as a man. He was worried about the power imbalance between us, about how I perceived him. And in that moment, my heart ached for him, for the quiet weight he carried so gracefully. I leaned forward, my hands clasped between my knees. "Julian," I said, using his first name without the professional buffer of a conversation about work. It felt both strange and perfectly right on my tongue. I have never once felt controlled. I felt respected and cared for. The last 2 words came out in a breath, quieter than the rest, but they hung in the air between us, undeniable. He let out a slow breath, a sigh of what sounded like relief. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. He looked at me, and his expression was open, unguarded in a way I had never seen before. "Good," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "That's very good to hear, Leo." We sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the fire dance. It was no longer an awkward silence, but a comfortable, shared space. The storm outside eventually softened to a steady, drumming rain. The power remained off. The house was an island in the dark, and we were its only inhabitants. In the flickering firelight, with the weight of his quiet confession settling between us, I felt the last of my own internal walls begin to crumble. The hope I had been nurturing in secret was no longer a fragile thing. It was starting to feel like a foundation. The project was nearing its end. Only a week remained on my contract. The knowledge sat like a stone in my stomach. The thought of not driving through those gates every morning, of not sharing the quiet space of the library with Julian, of not having his coffee appear on my desk like a silent offering, was a bleak prospect. Our routine had become the rhythm of my life, and I didn't know how to face the silence that would follow. The incident happened on a Wednesday. Julian had a business associate visiting, a sharp-edged man named Peterson with a suit that cost more than my car and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd arrived early for his meeting and found me in the library, carefully photographing a series of architectural blueprints. Peterson surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on me for a moment too long. "Croft keeps you busy," he said, his tone slick with insinuation. "Must be a very comprehensive project." I felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment. I knew what he was implying. The younger, poorer man given a project by the wealthy, older bachelor. It was a vile, lazy stereotype, and it hit me right where I was most vulnerable. "It's a significant historical archive," I said, my voice tight and cold. "It requires a specialist," he chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Of course. A specialist. I'm sure your talents are invaluable." Before I could form a response, Julian's voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold as ice. "They are." He was standing in the doorway to his office, his face a mask of controlled fury. He had heard everything. He walked slowly into the room, his gaze fixed on Peterson. He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet authority radiating from him was more intimidating than any shout. "Leo's work here is of the utmost importance to my family's legacy. He is a consummate professional, and you will afford him the respect he deserves." Peterson's smug expression faltered. He looked from Julian's thunderous face to mine and back again. "Julian, I was just making conversation." "You weren't," Julian said flatly. "My meeting with you can be rescheduled. My assistant will call you." It was a dismissal, absolute and final. Peterson, looking flustered for the first time, gave a curt nod and practically fled from the room. The silence he left behind was heavy. Julian stood there for a moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a deep, steadying breath, and the anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by something else. Weariness. He turned to me, his eyes filled with apology. "Leo, I am so sorry you had to endure that. It's not your fault," I said, my voice still shaky. But I was more shaken by Julian's fierce, immediate defense of me than I was by Peterson's insipid cruelty. He had protected me, not as an employer protecting an asset, but as a man protecting someone he cared about. The lines had not just been blurred, they had been obliterated. He walked over to me, stopping just a few feet away. "It is my fault," he insisted, his voice low and intense. "I brought him into this house. Into our space, our space." The words resonated deep inside me. "Julian, it's okay." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's not. That man's assumptions, they are exactly what I was afraid of. The reason for all the boundaries, the contract." He looked at me, his gaze searching, vulnerable. "Has this work been what you expected, Leo? Has it been worth it?" The question was loaded with a dozen others. He wasn't asking about the pay or the historical documents. He was asking if the complications, the unspoken feelings, the risk of exactly this kind of ugly speculation had been worth it. He was asking if I regretted stepping into his world. And I knew I had to be honest. Completely. This is it. The moment is here. My throat is tight. My heart is a frantic drum against my ribs. I look at him, at this steady, good man who just defended my honor with a quiet ferocity that took my breath away. And I know that silence is no longer an option. "It hasn't been what I expected," I say, my voice barely a whisper. "It's been more." His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He took a half-step closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The air grew thick, heavy with everything we had held back for weeks. "More?" he prompted, his voice a low murmur. "The contract is almost over," I said, the words tumbling out now, clumsy and earnest. "And the thought of not being here, of not seeing you, it's—" I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to. He reached out, not to touch me, but just to hover his hand in the space between us, a gesture of profound hesitation and longing. "Leo," he breathed my name like a prayer. "The boundaries were there to protect you. From men like Peterson. From me, I don't need protection from you," I said, my voice gaining strength. I never have. His hand dropped to his side. He looked from my eyes to my lips and back again, a silent question in his gaze. And in that moment, I realized the decision was mine. He would not cross that final line unless I invited him. He was giving me all the power. And with that power, I chose. I took that final step, closing the last inch of space between us. I looked up at him, and I let him see everything I was feeling. The fear, the hope, the deep, aching want. It was the last day. The archive was finished. The final report was written. The boxes were perfectly labeled, the digital catalog complete. I had spent the morning walking Julian through my work, my voice steady and professional as I explained my organizational system. He listened with his usual focused attention, asking intelligent questions, his expression unreadable. It was all very correct, very formal, a return to the roles we had first established. And it was killing me. When I was done, we stood in the center of the library, the fruits of my 6 weeks of labor surrounding us. The project was over. My reason for being here was gone. The work is exceptional, Leo, he said, his voice formal. You've exceeded all expectations. I'll have my foundation's accounting department process your final payment immediately. My heart sank. He was putting the walls back up, brick by professional brick. Was I wrong? Had I misread everything? The fear of rejection was a cold, sharp thing in my chest. Thank you, I said, my voice hollow. I should gather my things. I turned to go to my work table, but his voice stopped me. Leo, I turned back. The formality was gone from his face, replaced by that same raw vulnerability I'd seen after the incident with Peterson. He looked conflicted, torn. I'm going to miss having you here, he said softly, the words a simple, honest confession. And there it was. The opening. The last chance. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly. It's been more than a job for me, Julian, I said, my voice shaking but clear. I think you know that a long, agonizing silence stretched between us. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his strength. When he opened them, his gaze was resolute. Yes, he said. I do. He walked slowly toward me, stopping just in front of me. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Technically, he said, his voice a low murmur. Everything that has happened in this house, everything that has been said, it's all still under the non-disclosure agreement. Ice flooded my veins. Was this his way of ending it? Of reminding me of the rules, of the silence I was bound to? My throat closed up. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, because his expression softened instantly. A small, tender smile touched his lips. But there's a clause I'd like to add, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial whisper that was meant only for me. He raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing my jawline, sending a shiver down my spine. The touch was featherlight, reverent. His eyes held mine, dark and serious and full of a feeling that mirrored my own. Kiss me first. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea, a surrender. It was him, once again, handing me the power, asking for my consent, my action. It was the most ethical, breathtakingly romantic command I had ever heard. My breath hitched, and in that moment, all the fear, all the uncertainty, all the analysis, it all just dissolved. It became simple. Him. Me. Here. Now. I leaned in, rising on my toes slightly, and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was not explosive or desperate. It was slow. It was a discovery. His lips were soft, warm, and they yielded to mine with a quiet sigh of relief. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. His hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers lacing into my hair, holding me to him gently, possessively. My own hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was right. Utterly, completely, unarguably right. It tasted of coffee and longing and weeks of unspoken tension finally being released. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. Leo, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't speak. I just laced my fingers with his, our hands falling into place as if they had always been meant to hold each other. The silence that followed was the most profound and peaceful I had ever known. The NDA was broken, and in its place, something new, something real, was just beginning. I didn't go home that night. We talked for hours, sitting by the fire again, but this time our knees were touching, our hands intertwined. We talked about everything and nothing. His childhood in this house, my nomadic life before settling here, our shared love for the quiet persistence of history. It was easy. All the tension that had defined our interactions was gone, replaced by a warm, flowing current of understanding. Waking up the next morning in one of his guest rooms, a concession to taking things slowly that I was grateful for, was disorienting. The sheets were impossibly soft, the light streaming through the window golden and gentle. But a familiar chill of anxiety crept over me. The reality of the situation began to settle in. He was Julian Croft, and I was me. The chasm between our lives seemed immense in the harsh light of day. Was last night a beautiful, isolated moment, a fantasy born of proximity and a shared storm? Was I just a footnote in the history of this house, like one of his grandfather's letters? I found him in the kitchen, nursing a mug of coffee and looking out at the gardens. He was already dressed, looking as impeccable as ever. My heart did a nervous flip. He turned as I entered, and his face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile that made him look 10 years younger. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "There's coffee." The simple domesticity of the moment was a balm to my anxious soul. I poured myself a mug, my hands not quite steady. He seemed to notice. He walked over, taking the mug from my hands and setting it on the counter. Then he took my hands in his. "You're worried," he stated gently. I couldn't meet his eyes. I just nodded, staring at our joined hands. His were so much larger, warmer than mine. "It's a lot to process," I mumbled. "The difference between us. Your world. My world, Leo, look at me," I did. His expression was serious, his gaze unwavering. "There is no my world and your world anymore, unless you want there to be. What happened last night, that was not a momentary lapse. It was a beginning. For me," he paused, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "But it has to be a beginning for you, too. Without pressure, without obligation." He was addressing my deepest fears head-on. He understood the power dynamics, the potential for this to feel transactional, and he was dismantling it, piece by piece. "The contract for the archive is finished," he continued, his tone practical but kind. "Our professional relationship is over. Whatever happens next is entirely personal. It's two men getting to know each other. That's all. What if people talk?" I whispered, thinking of Peterson. "What if they say what he said?" "Let them," Julian said, his voice firm. "Their opinions are meaningless to me. The only opinion I care about is yours." He squeezed my hand. "We can be as private as you need. Or we can walk through the front door and not give a damn. The choice, Leo, will always be yours." His reassurance was a quiet, steady foundation settling into place beneath me. He wasn't just saying the words. I could feel the truth of them in his touch, in his gaze. He wanted to build something with me, an equal partnership, despite the glaring inequalities in our circumstances. A few days later, he proved it. He called me with a proposition. "The foundation is looking to fund a new initiative," he explained over the phone. "Digitizing the archives of some of the city's smaller historical societies. They lack the funding and expertise. It would be a major, multi-year project. It needs a director." My breath caught. "Julian, it's a real position, Leo. It would go through the foundation's official hiring process. You would report to the board, not to me. You would have your own office, your own team, your own work, completely independent of me." He paused. "You're the most qualified person I know to run it. But I won't submit your name unless you want me to. This is about your career, your independence. Not about us." It was the perfect solution. A way for him to use his resources to help me, but in a way that empowered me, that respected my skills and my agency. It wasn't a handout. It was an opportunity one had genuinely earned. It was an act of profound care. Our first public outing was a test. We went to a gallery opening, an event sponsored by his foundation. I was nervous, my hands sweating as we walked in. The room was full of the city's elite, people like Peterson. Heads turned. I could feel their eyes on us, the whispers that followed in our wake. My old instinct to retreat, to make myself small, flared up. Julian must have sensed it. He casually placed a hand on the small of my back, a simple, grounding touch. It wasn't possessive or showy. It was a quiet gesture of solidarity. A statement. He guided me over to an elderly woman on the foundation's board. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Leo Vance." "Leo, this is Eleanor Vance, our board chair." "Wait, Vance?" I looked at her, confused. She smiled, a bright, intelligent twinkle in her eye. "No relation," she said to me with a conspiratorial wink. "But with a fine name like that, you're bound to be a good man." Julian had introduced me to the most powerful person in the room, not as his date, but as a person of interest in his own right. He spent the rest of the evening introducing me to people as a brilliant archivist whose work I deeply admire. He was building my reputation, not showing me off. Later that night, As we stood on the balcony of his house, looking up at the stars, I leaned my head against his shoulder. "Thank you," I said quietly. "For tonight." He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me closer. "There's nothing to thank me for. I was just introducing my favorite person to some people who should know him, my favorite person." The words were so simple, so direct, and they landed right in the center of my heart. I looked up at him, at the strong, kind lines of his face illuminated by the moonlight. The fear was gone. The insecurity had quieted. In its place was a feeling of peace, of rightness. I had spent so long building walls to keep the world out, and this man hadn't torn them down. He had simply opened a door and waited for me to walk through it on my own. We made a conscious choice to build our life slowly, deliberately. We defined the boundaries. When I was at the foundation, overseeing the new project I had, of course, been hired for, he was Mr. Croft, a benefactor I treated with professional respect. We never blurred those lines. It was important for my own sense of self, and he not only understood, he insisted on it. But in the evenings and on weekends, he was Julian. And his house, the grand, intimidating mansion, slowly started to feel like home. I kept my small apartment, another thing he insisted on, so I would always have my own space, my own key to my own door. But I spent more and more nights at his place. We fell into a comfortable rhythm, a domesticity that was both new and felt like it had existed forever. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen to find him standing at the stove, making pancakes. He was wearing an old, soft t-shirt and gray sweatpants, his hair endearingly messy. He looked nothing like the billionaire from the magazine clipping and everything like the man I loved. "Morning," he smiled, flipping a pancake with an expert flick of his wrist. I thought we could eat on the patio. We sat outside in the warm morning sun, the garden quiet except for the chirping of birds. The table was set for two. It felt so normal, so beautifully, wonderfully normal. I watched him as he poured syrup on his pancakes, the way he would look at me over the rim of his coffee mug, his eyes crinkling at the corners when I said something that amused him. This quiet intimacy, this simple shared moment, felt more real and more valuable than all the wealth and history that surrounded us. It was the foundation he had talked about, the thing built on moments no one else could see. I looked around at the magnificent house, the sprawling gardens, the physical evidence of his different world. For the first time, it didn't feel like his world. It felt like ours. The age difference, the money, they hadn't vanished. They were still facts, but they were no longer barriers. They were just part of the context of our story, the backdrop to the quiet, steady love we were building. He must have seen the look on my face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft. I reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm thinking about that NDA," I said, a smile playing on my lips. "And how grateful I am that you broke it." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. "It was the best deal I ever broke," he said. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was it. This was home. Not the house, not the wealth, but him. This steady, protective, gentle man who had used his power not to control me, but to set me free. Free from my fear, free from my isolation, and free to love him completely. The silence I had once curated to protect myself had been filled with the sound of his steady heartbeat, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.